this month, since we just finished celebrating, or not, the word not celebrating, but commemorating the Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust, we thought it would be a good opportunity to have our expert on Judaism, my partner in crime here, to talk about the denominations in Judaism. And I just want to go back to some of the things that Vatican II and the resulting documents had to say about the relationship between the church and Judaism. One cannot fully understand the church without appreciating the intimate relationship between Christianity and Judaism. So that was one of the prime elements of where we began. And if I can find here we go. A couple of other items. Dialogue with Jews affects how Christians understand their faith because so many Christian teachings have been premised on inadequate notions about Judaism. And today we'd like to start to clear up some of those misconceptions. There was a document in 1998, which was 30 years after the council, called We Remember, a reflection on the Shoah, or the Holocaust. And it encourages Christians to do a couple of things. The church has a special obligation to reflect on this horrible genocide. The Shoah took place in Europe, countries of long-standing Christian civilization. It raises the question of the relation between the Nazi persecution and the attitudes down through the centuries of Christians towards Jews. The church admits of anti-Judaism in its attitude. It acknowledges the erroneous interpretation of the New Testament regarding the Jewish people and their alleged culpability. And I think one that is most important, it makes a distinction between the anti-Judaism and the anti-Semitism of the 19th and 20th centuries based on racism and extreme forms of nationalism. The Nazi regime intended to exterminate the Jewish people for the sole reason of their Jewish origin. So I think whatever we Christians can do to learn more and understand more about our Jewish brothers and sisters is all for the good. So what we thought we would do today is have Rabbi Gadi talk to us about the different Jewish denominations and their relationship to and the whole underlying element of remembering the Shoah. So, Gadi?
Okay, thank you. If we can just close the doors, if you don't mind. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, at this point. Thank you. So I'd like to add before we start that actually today is the official day of Israel's Independence Day too. We celebrated it yesterday, because of this day to the proximity to Shabbat. Whenever it happens, because people want to celebrate, and if it's right before Shabbat, the Orthodox people would have to stop before Shabbat. So, and we'll understand that issue actually today. So, coming out of the discussion of Second Vatican Council and looking at the Christian Reformation, we understand that every movement that has existed for as long as Judaism existed would have reformations within it. So what I'd like to first do is introduce some of the terms that we will be using in the development, the discussion of the development of Jewish denominations. So what we know today, if you ask any average American right on the street, not like Jimmy Kimmel does on Sunset Boulevard, because I don't know if anybody knows anything there. But if you ask an average American what they know about Jewish denominations, you'll basically name the three main ones, right? Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Now, I don't even know if people would list them in this order, but they would be familiar with the three names. So when we're talking about the current three big movements, we have to understand that the roots of these three movements always existed. And I'll just give you, it's almost like a mathematical equation that always exists in this world when you are dealing with human beings. So the first one would be the one that always existed, right? If we look at the Catholic Church, so we're the church that existed since the middle of the 4th century. And then came the Reformation. And then it reformed something, right? So it went out of whatever was considered it. It didn't even have a specific name. Judaism would be Judaism. In the case of the church, it would be Catholicism, right? Or Christianity. It wouldn't even be called maybe Catholicism. And then there's a reform of a type. And once you have that reform, and we'll look at the history and the roots of that reform in Judaism. But if you take any reform that comes out of some sort of a norm, so when we're talking about the three denominations, we know that they have actually roots in ancient civilizations, ancient Judaism for sure. So the mathematical scheme is that you have something that existed, and then something that reformed it and came out of it. So you have now two names that have to kind of compete. And then from that conversation, you get a third. It's almost like the book of John, right? The Gospel of John. That in the beginning there was God, right? And then the Word, once God utters the word, God, right? There's something else, and then there's the conversation, right? Same thing. So the orthodoxy, and I would say orthodoxy not even as specifically the Jewish orthodoxy, but any orthodoxy that exists is the traditional. And then once something comes out of that, it behooves it to respond to it. So when we're talking about the three current Jewish denominations, the point that started creating that split is the emancipation in Europe. When Jews started to being emancipated and being as equal and receiving citizenship in Western, Eastern Europe, it was probably a process of almost 100 years that started in the 1770s and then continues until Zionism took over and started the mission of returning to the land of Israel in the, let's say, the late 1880s. So that 100 years created that conversation. So when Jews started receiving emancipation and equality and citizenship, and They didn't have the restrictions of quotas against them anymore. They were equal. When that happened, the strength of the Jewish community and its coercion ability on the individual totally shifted. It wasn't as strong. The grip was not as strong anymore, because if you're an equal citizen, you can go and do something else. You don't have to do Jewish. You don't have to live in the Jewish community in the shtetl. You can move to the big city and you can have a life. So when that happened, then all the diversity that might have existed under the surface now has the freedom and the ability to surface. And once that happened, a few things came after it. And these are the terms that we have to use. One, we're talking about when you're the more traditional, you be more, in a sense, hard to change, of course, and to adapt to new and modern society, right? So right there's a conversation. Who is going to go to the future and who's staying behind? Who is considered anachronistic? Who's considered chauvinistic? And all these conversations now are surfacing. So the reform, and I wouldn't call it a reform movement yet, because it was not a movement. It was a conversation that people wanted to do something else. Now, of course, if you have people who originally were not, let's say, as connected to their tradition for many reasons, there could be many reasons why people were already, even if they dressed the same way and spoke the same language, were not connected to those things anymore. When the Israelites were redeemed from Egypt and rescued from Egypt, the Talmud says for three things they earned the merit to be rescued by God. One is that they did not change their clothing. Second, they didn't change their names, and they didn't change their language. So these are the three identifiable identities that if you dress a certain way, if you speak a certain way, and if you name your kids a certain name, that's what you mean. You are part of that community or you're not. So we see differences actually in exactly these things. And that's why the conversation between Orthodoxy and Reform is very heated. Because one says to the other, you are irrelevant, and the other one says to the other one, you're irrelevant. For different reasons. One says you went out of the pale, outside the pale, because you don't identify yourself anymore in clothing. You don't wear a yarmulke. You don't wear certain Jewish clothes. Your tzitzit outside. You look like any German, any Pole. Maybe, I don't know, in Poland it was, I think it was slower because it was Eastern. But let's concentrate, let's say, on the origin of the Reform movement in Germany. Then you look like a German. That's one thing, the identifiable sign that way. Then the language. So of course they wanted to speak German. They didn't want to speak, of course they didn't speak Yiddish really to begin with, because they wanted to speak the original German. So they're not speaking Yiddish. They're not, their prayer now, they're considering moving the prayers to German from Hebrew. And then they make a statement saying we're giving up the the aspirations to move to the Holy Land or back to Israel at any point. We are now more nationalistic than Jewish, right? We're more, our particularism is really the state and not not our faith. So that's the kind of movement that starts to break away from traditional communities. And I'm not even talking about those who don't have faith at all, right? So they, of course, shed everything. But even if you are secular in any way and every way, and you don't believe, you're not a person of faith, even though you will need a transitional generation until you can really leave the community in many ways, right? Even if you move to the big city, you still converse in the same language, in the same terms as your brothers and cousins who stayed Orthodox. So then the name Orthodox starts to surface because it has to in a sense, respond to the Reform movement. So now, probably in the again the mid 1880s, it becomes a movement. And if we continue with the kind of the table of terms, you have a very important component in this conversation that is not often brought in because we're so used to speaking in terms of European Jewry, but it is the non-European Jewry. So you have Northern Africans, you have Yemenite Jews in the Arabian Peninsula. You have all these other Asian communities that that process did not occur for them, and we will speak about it, in a little bit. But all this process that we're now talking about is happening in Europe, and of course, there's a famous depiction of Napoleon emancipating the Jews of France in 1806 or 7, right after the French Revolution. And then there's a revolution in the world in general. The whole world, Judaism never operated in a vacuum. It always operated in a larger context. And in this case, the world was reforming. Another aspect of this is America. Things that are happening in Europe not necessarily happening in America, and vice versa. And then you have a fourth, I would say, element of the geography at least, and that's Israel. So you have Israel, you have Europe, you have America, and you have the European versus the non-European.
Let me ask you a question. When you use the term America,
Yeah.
are you specifically talking about the United States or the American?
Yes, thank you for pointing that. The Americas. The Americas. Because if we have to trace the origin of Jews in America, in the Americas, it would be from Spain, right? The expulsion in 1492, and that's around the same time of Columbus finding America. So this whole movement of Jews actually started to South America, and then it moved up to the United States, and before, of course, this whole process happened. But the movement that happened in America will end up having this conversation because the third movement, even though it had some minor roots in Europe, the conversation between the Orthodoxy and Reform gives birth to something in the middle, as we kind of say, and we'll understand what it means. Really, it takes really momentum. It gets momentum in America, and the conservative movement really grows up in the United States. And the first seminary was in Europe, but it didn't have that much power as it got in the seminary here. I grew up secular. I became Orthodox in New York, and then I became, in my ordination, I got a conservative ordination. So I kind of know the three philosophies personally. So that would be also from my personal experience how I developed and how I arrived where I wanted to be and feel comfortable where I am. So today is really kind of the development of the denominations. If we would, we'll see that there's interest, we will expand this to speak specifically about each denomination. I'm happy to do that. So even within those big philosophies, there are, of course, sub-philosophies. So, for example, in the Orthodox world, we started having a conversation about, again, always in conversation with modernity. So, the modern Orthodoxy, as we call it today, also was born in Europe, and Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who started talking about this idea, this revolutionary idea of you can stay Orthodox and keep your boundaries tighter with your external environment, the non-Jewish environment, but yet you have to somehow adapt to modernity. You have to learn something. And he comes up with this idea of Torah with derech eretz, with the way of the people. With the way of the people, which means that you can have secular education. And Yeshiva University in New York, that is my alma mater, it is the philosophy of having a yeshiva, which is the Jewish education part, and university, which is the secular education. And you go both. You go in between those. So in the morning you have, it's a dual curriculum program. You study Jewish studies in the morning, and whatever secular general major you're pursuing, you can do it in the afternoon. So I always say that when I went to the Saisim School of Business at Yeshiva University, and in the morning we studied the Jewish studies, and I studied for an undergraduate degree also in Jewish studies, an associate degree. So in the morning you study and Torah, and you learn how to be a better person, right? And then in the afternoon, you go to the business school, and they teach you how to be, the more aggressive you can get, the better, in a sense. So, but that's what scared the Jewish communities that lived in shtetl, that their children now are going to be like everybody else, or somehow be aggressive that way, or learn the ways of the people, and that will corrupt them somehow. To each his own, but the philosophy, I think that that prevails has to have some adaptation to modernity, whichever it happens. So all three denominations have adopted to newer times. to say that Orthodox look like the Jews looked like in Mount Sinai when they received the Torah, of course, wouldn't be correct. I would say maybe the Yemenite Jews look a little bit with the Jalabiyah and all that, but anyway, none of the Jews that live today are look like Moses and the people of Israel walking in the desert. They've all adapted in some way or another. The question is, how much have they adapted, and how much in their philosophy they want to adapt? So this is the way that one of my professor, Rabbi Joel Roth, at the Jewish Theological Seminary said, imagine a chess board, a chess game, and there's a conversation, right? There's a game. So in a sense, the Orthodox community are not moving the chess pieces a lot, right? They kind of have almost like a snapshot of the set table, Shulchan Aruch, the code of law, and the Jewish code of law from the 1500s, and every new law has to first start there, and then work through the sources. So they don't move the pieces a lot. They don't change a lot. The Reform movement, on the other hand, said, we're not obligated for this. We're not even playing this. If we want to change something, we're not obligated to go through this whole process of looking at a book that was written 700 years ago to figure out what we want to do today. We'll just say, okay, if we feel that Jews should go to, it's better for us that Jews congregate on Shabbat, and therefore we can allow them to drive on Shabbat, which is a difficult decision because there are not a lot of restrictions that are actually written in the Torah about Shabbat directly. It says, don't do any melacha. So it's a type of work that is creative and destructive. So there could be many applications of it, and that's how we live, that we derived many applications from just that word. But directly, a restriction on Shabbat, there really are only mainly two. The one is not to light fire on Shabbat, and the other one is not to go between, or move things at least between the private domain and the public domain. So, but the Reform movement said, if we think that we want the people to congregate, we're not going to go through a whole process and see how we can allow it. We're just going to allow it. The conservative movement in the middle said, no, we are going to maybe end up like the Reform in 15 years, allowing to drive to synagogue on Shabbat, to allow accept gay marriage, and so forth. But it will be done through a different process. And that process is to find the way of halakha that could maybe permit certain things under certain circumstances, places, times, and amount. So that's the main difference. So the Reform movement is not on the board, not playing, and the Orthodox is not playing in some other ways or playing very slow, and the conservative movement tries to stay in the game and not have it, covered with dust. So that's just the philosophy. Now, the way you identify the Jewish denominations when you walk into a synagogue, how would you know if you're in an Orthodox synagogue or non-Orthodox synagogue, because there's also a line somewhere there too with the Orthodox denominations, and there are many Orthodox denominations. Their practices vary, but to a certain degree, but they all share some things that non-Orthodox denominations all share. And what are they? Egalitarianism is number one. So when you walk into an Orthodox synagogue, you would see men sit in one section and women would sit in a different section, if they even have a section. Some synagogues would have maybe a section upstairs for women, because women are not obligated in the same way as men. So that's right there. There's a very clear line. And it's very interesting because there is a line in an Orthodox synagogue, and it's called mechitza. The mechitza, literally the dividing wall between the sections, the men and the women section. But it really also makes a mechitza, makes a division between Orthodox and Orthodoxy and non-Orthodoxy. So the conservative movement and the Reform movement, starting of course with the Reform movement and then the conservative movement followed, is the equality, the egalitarianism between men and women. We're all counted exactly the same. In Orthodox synagogue, only men are counted. In non-Orthodox synagogues, they're all counted. So it's interesting for me, in my journey, I started by not really thinking about those things growing up. I mean, I went to an Orthodox synagogue by default, but never thought about this idea of men obligated, women, because we were not practicing, we were kind of traditional, but going to synagogue on Shabbat, but then, not obligated to anything much. So that wasn't an issue at all. And I grew up in an area that was very equal, very egalitarian, very rational, in a city that has two famous campuses on it, the Weizmann Institute, the Agricultural University. So very rational and secular. We had everybody. So then coming to New York and becoming Orthodox, it made sense to me that men praying separately than women, because that's how it's been. That's the tradition. And then when I kind of crossed the aisle and became more conservative, especially when I went to the conservative seminary, it started feeling odd that women pray next to me in the beginning. But now if you asked me, where are you located? I would say I'm conservative. Because of exactly those two things. I'm now committed to egalitarianism. Today, if I go to an Orthodox synagogue, of course there aren't women praying, directly next to me. It feels odd. Actually, we're missing somebody. We're missing half of our people. But on the other hand, I can't be reformed because I do believe in the power of the law, the Jewish law, and our obligation to it. So if we're going to somehow reform ourselves, which we all do to a degree, then it has to be in the context of the conversation that God started with us in Mount Sinai. So some would say we are direct descendants of those ideas, and some would say, no, we have reformed. One big reform that all Jews are descendants of today is the destruction of the temple and the establishment of rabbinic Judaism. It had roots before the first century, but once the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and it behooved Judaism to create a different body to maintain the integrity of Judaism even without a temple, and the Sanhedrin moved to a different town and started operating there. From that point, we didn't have the temple and the actual sacrifices and the high priest in the temple and so forth. And we had to substitute it with other things. So we're all descendants of those people. All three denominations, any Jew that lives today is a descendant of that. So right there, we have reformed in a big way since Sinai and since entering the land. Even the transformation between journeying from Egypt to the promised land, that's a big transition. You are without land, and then you are with land. Almost the same idea that happened in modern Zionism, that brought the people with no land into a people with land. A big difference. So there's a whole new conversation that is happening now in Israel between the three denominations. Because the birth of all these three denominations happened outside the discussion of sovereignty, which is a big difference. Big difference. Because the conversation now in Israel is about sovereignty. Which denomination should have sovereignty on the Jewish law? And the same conversation happens now. So right now, Orthodoxy is really administered pretty much all Jewish law in Israel. And there is a conversation of somehow opening it up to other denominations. So I think we understand now the movement between the Orthodoxy and Reform on many levels. Let me now look into the way that the third component gives birth to itself somehow. So I'll start with the specific history of the conservative movement in America, because that's really where it is. In 1883, the Reform movement in America, it came from Europe, it came to America, established a theological seminary in Cincinnati, and that was their base, for the first base in America. In 1883, they were ordaining their first cohort of rabbis. At the festive dinner, the graduating dinner, they served pork. What would you say about that? If you were a Jew, you reformed, you understand the need for reform, but it's called the Treif Banquet. They got the name, the Treif Banquet, because they just ignored the kosher laws. I think they didn't mix meat and dairy. That's the only maybe thing that they kept there. But everything else, and I'm not even sure, I don't remember all the details, but some people at that event said, okay, you've taken it too far. Because we understand reform, we understand we have to walk with the time. But when you are now introducing something that is totally outside the pale of Judaism, then we have no choice but to break away from you, because we are conservative reform. We're reform, but we're conservative. We want to conserve the law. And they broke off and they established their seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan, and that's the seminary that I went to. And in 1886, it really began the conservative movement in America. And it's very interesting the way, just as a side note, how the conservative movement in America proliferated itself was through the communities. It started not with the people, but with the seminary, with the intellectualism. And then they minted new rabbis, and then they said, who wants to buy our rabbis? We just have new denomination, literally and figuratively, and who wants to trade in this denomination? And then conservative rabbis began accepting getting jobs in all denominations. Actually, there's some that went to Orthodox. The difference at that point was not that great, actually, between conservative and Orthodoxy. The main, let's say, reformation of the conservative movement now happened in almost 100 years later in 1985. 1985, the seminary decided to follow the reform trajectory and allowed women's ordination. So 1985, it was the first cohort of women rabbis in the conservative movement, which created the schism between those who felt more conservative and those who were on the more liberal side. So in a sense, and I think, if we bring it back to the kind of the seminal conversation that we're always having in regards to Jewish denominations, and I would say religious denominations, political denominations, any denominations, any group of people that somehow decide to unionize, I would say has the same movement, is whatever it was, takes itself for granted. Some people, in the first opportunity they have, they say, no, it's too much, we break away from you. And then there's somehow the coming back to the middle. So every time there's a break, it happens in the same way. So Orthodoxy has within it the modern Orthodoxy that wanted to acquire also secular education and vocation, not vocation, jobs, be part of the general population, assimilate as much as possible. And there's the big fights also between them, big tension. Because how far are you going to go? How much is it gonna? How much do you allow? So on both ends, there are always going to be then people in the middle that are still on the other two sides of the aisle, but they would maybe in many ways would be closer to each other than even within their denomination. So when you look at the history of it, since Egypt, and we'll kind of summarize it in the last few minutes, the Talmud tells us that only 20% of the Israelites actually left Egypt. 80%, and they use a word that means 5 to say they were only a fifth, or they had 5 sets of children, because all the other 4 sets of parents perished in Egypt because they didn't put the blood on the doorpost. That blood on the doorpost is what the denominations see as the separator. Where do you put the blood on the doorpost? And you're willing to put your blood on that opening, that gate, saying, I'm not crossing that. That's really the conversation. Then we have in Greek, in the Greek times, those who wanted to Hellenize and have Hellenized, totally assimilated into gymnasiums and all the institutions, the Greek institutions, and the philosophy too, and became more closer to Greek philosophy in many ways. You know, whether we talk about creation or God or anything like that. So, and those who battled them to really to blood, literally. They in the story of Hanukkah, when the Maccabees re-seized the temple, that's the conversation. Those who were pro-Greek and those who said, no, we're not pro-Greek. We want to stay within our doors. So then first century with the temple. The temple was destroyed according to Jewish sources because of those infighting. When the Romans seized Jerusalem for like 3 years, the Jews within the walls had enough food and could have survived for another few years. But those zealots within the walls that burned all the food supply, that they would have to fight the Romans. So these are serious philosophical differences. Before I started with Project Genesis and the interfaith conversation, I have to say, all Christians were the same to me. I didn't really know what exactly is the difference between Catholics and Protestants. Definitely within Protestant denominations, forget about it, as we say. So, but these are important philosophical differences that I think are mirroring the philosophical differences between people in general. If you look at politically, there are always people who are attracted to the extremes and people who are more moderate, and they may be left or may be right, but they're moderate. They're still within that 70% circle, within the middle circle. So that's really kind of the development of Jewish denominations. And I would just conclude by just saying that in Israel, the conversation, because we added the element of sovereignty and the relationship also between that sovereignty and people who are not Jewish that live under the sovereignty, which for 2,000 years Jews did not have. Their laws, their Jewish laws, stayed within the community. But now with sovereignty, it has a whole different conversation to be had. What do you do to affect also people around you? And that could be maybe a separate conversation altogether. So thank you, and I hope this was a good summary.
Thank you. Thank you, Gadi. I just have a couple of thoughts as we were talking. Not so much on the specifics, but on a lot of the underlying thoughts and ideas. First one we talked about was the idea of Reformation. The Catholic Church always had this, it has a phrase that was used quite often, especially in the years around Vatican II. In Latin, the phrase was Ecclesia semper reformanda, which means that the church must always be reformed. Okay? And if you look at the history of the church, you see the multiplicity, for example, of religious orders. And most of these religious orders grew out of the necessity to reform things that were going on in the church that were not kosher. And so the church has always had, for example, this history of reform, even what we would call the Protestant Reformation. I mean, Martin Luther was on the right track. He understood, and anybody who looks at the history of the church at that point really would recognize the fact that the church had to be reformed. Now, of course, once you start a reform, different philosophies come into play, egos come into play, and so on and so forth. But the movement to reform by Luther was right on. Okay? So I would say that probably the greatest enemy to any religious institution and any religion is the status quo. I mean, we see it, the tendency even today to bring it right to May 6th, 2022. You look at the drive of so many people who want to go back to the normal, pre-COVID. Right? And we know, well, let's put it this way, to go back to the normal, which can never happen, would be for people to make the same mistakes that they made that got us to where we are today, all right, in many things. We have to adapt. We have to reform ourselves. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Right now in the church, for example, we have this movement to the concept and the idea of synodality, of bringing people, all the people in the church together and have a say as to what they see the church will be. Right? Another concept that comes up is this idea of tradition. And the struggle, for example, as to what is the true tradition of any religion. And that's not necessarily the easiest question in the world to answer, because for many, tradition is custom. Right? And we know, culturally speaking, customs change. And we see so often in the history of the church where missionaries would go out to different countries and different continents, all right, and almost impose the customs of Western Europe, for example, and the church upon people of Japan, of Asia, and Africa, and so on and so forth. Didn't work. Didn't work. Because those customs had no relevance to the people that were being preached to. So part of growing in a religion is constantly to try to discern, excuse me, what is and what are the real true traditions. What is it that must be handed down? And that's the Latin word tradition, to tradere, to hand down. What are those elements within that religion that must be handed down to keep the continuity? Right? Not just not customs, but tradition. And that's something that will always be in the process of trying to discern and so on. And I think also, too, very much depends upon what is your basic understanding of God in terms of how you look at the world. Okay. So, for example, in Christianity, we claim that there are we talk about a Trinity, three persons in one God. Well, depending on which aspect of that God that you stress, if you stress, for example, the oneness of God, which we have done which we have done for many, many, many years, especially up to more recent times, then if God is one and God is not changeable, then the church that follows this God shouldn't change. Okay. Why? Because we have a God that doesn't change. All right. But if you begin to understand, which has become more predominant today, you begin to understand God as Trinity, you begin to understand that, first of all, God is essentially relationship. God is especially in movement. As theologians would say today, God is a verb and not a noun. But if you begin to see that we begin to focus on the idea of God as essentially relationship, then our whole perspective on religion and belief in God changes. Because then everything is seen, for example, in terms of relationship. Give you an example. Morality. To see God as one, you project the idea that the law is one, it's unchangeable, and so on and so forth. And therefore, if you break the tenets of the law, the moral law, you sin. But if you begin to see morality in terms of relationship, that all morality is in one sense relationship, then you begin to see the nuances of how we begin to try to interpret our morality, our ethics, and so on and so forth. And those are topics that we can spend much time later on talking about. So those are some of the things that came to mind as I was listening, because we see that even within Judaism, things change, and things will continue to change.
Yeah, I would just clarify from the Jewish perspective to what you just said is God, you're right. We believe that God is unchangeable and God is one. We don't have that aspect of the Trinity, of course, but we do believe that we change and time change. And because the law is one and God is one, we always have to find a way to reinterpret or see the original meaning and the idea of the halakha and the law. So the law in Hebrew, that kind of construct that walk with us through the generations, literally called halakha, which means to walk. It walks with that. So God does not change, but we do. So yeah.
And again, I mean, as I was growing up in my education, it became very clear that when we talked about the law, the Ten Commandments, let's say, okay, that the law was an expression of God's love for his people. Right? God was so concerned about his people that he gave the law, right, to help them focus on him. So that law in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's not necessarily a restrictive thing, but it's an expression of law. All right? So again, under that perception, all right, that for the Jews to see the law and God as one makes all the sense in the world, because it's an expression of the love of God. And if something is rooted in love, all right, it's totally open-ended. It's open to develop and to change and so on and so forth.
So some would say that the kind of the transition between Orthodoxy and Reform is that transition between obligation to the law and non-obligation to the law, as I was explaining with the chessboard.
Right.
That if you're not committed to the law as is, then you
Yeah, and again, what's happening today in theology, at least in Christian theology, all right, we're moving from the idea of being, and not that we're disregarding sin, don't get me wrong, but we're moving from the idea of sinfulness, radical sinfulness, to the idea of being incomplete, which in a certain sense makes sense in terms of if you understand the word or the concept of sin, the biblical concept of sin, all right, brings about the idea of missing the mark. And when you miss the mark, something needs to be brought back, all right, towards the mark. And that's what we're working through in terms of ourselves, that we are constantly in the process of recreating ourselves and allowing God to recreate us so that we become more and more complete. And to me, the idea of being perfect is pretty much the idea of being complete, being in harmony, all parts fitting together. And that's an eternal struggle for human beings.
So I just have to conclude by the question that people refer to me and always say, so then what are you? Are you Orthodox, Conservative, Reformed? And I say, I am conservatively Reformed Orthodox. I always have orthodoxy in me, and I understand what we always have to reform, but when we do that, when we reform, we should reform conservatively. And that's really, I would say, the movement and the development of the Jewish movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
See you next month.
Right.